Okay, to start our fidget spinner cap, we start with a new Blender scene, and I want to select everything in it, so A couple times, and delete everything in the scene. Also want to set up some user preferences. What I want is to be able to 3D print this, so under the mesh 3D print, I need that toolbox. Save those user settings. Also, that's in the add-ons. Also in the input, I do need to emulate a 3-button mouse here and with the touchpad, but I do have a 3-button mouse, so that's usually on for a good reason. And I want to emulate the numpad, so I can use my number keys on the top of my keyboard instead of using the number pad on the side. So that's good. Save the user settings there, and I think we're ready to start. So 5 on the keyboard puts me in ortho mode, and 1 puts me in the front view, which is going to be slightly different than what we're used to. Also, I want to set my units up in my scene. So I want to go to millimeters, my unit setup, and make sure length is on metric. Sometimes that's on none, and that might not work. It won't work very well. Okay, so I want my other settings with this toolbar. So at this point, I can start with a simple curve, a Bezier curve. It's actually quite large, so I'm going to zoom out quite a bit, and I want to edit its vertices and their locations. So let's go into edit mode, and what I see are 2 vertices here with their control handles, and they're huge for our fidget spinner. Anyway, so I'm going to pick the vertex here in the middle, not one on the ends, because the vertex is actually in between the 2 control handles. For instance, if I drag that, I can see that the curve is curving here. However, one of the problems that I have is, let's go back to object mode. I can see that the curve already has a curve to it, and that's in the X and Y plane, not in the X and Z plane that I need. So let's just rotate that along the X-axis for 90 degrees, so it's standing up. That should work. Go back to the front view. Now I can see the curvature, and now I want to select that vertex, and I want to move it to 0, 0. Now I don't want to use local coordinates, so I need to. It's very important to click that global value here and set 0 in the X. Y is always going to be 0 because that would be coming in out of the screen, and we really need a flat shape here. And then 0 in the Z, and there it is. Okay. Now I need to get the control handles a little bit closer, and I'm going to select that far vertex. Well, I can move its control handles. Doesn't really matter where, I just want them smaller so I can zoom in and out and be easier with it. But the vertex in the middle, it definitely, this is where I start setting up the fidget spinner. Now this is gonna be at 4 millimeters, 0 in the Y and 0 in the Z. Now I can zoom in to that 4 millimeter gap. Now I don't want to go too far before I move the control handles to a good amount. Again, make them smaller so I can see. Now I'm not too worried about the curvature at this point. I'll just zoom in, and there I can see. Now I can see the grid and the curvature. Again, not too worried. Just want to get the control handles small so I can manage them a little easier. There we go. I don't really want to see those arrows on the line, so those normals. So I uncheck those in that toolbar, transform toolbar. So now I can add, so I have that second vertex on the right at 4, 0, and that will take up the radius of the bore. The bore of the fidget spinner bearing is 8 millimeters, so going from the center of the fidget spinner itself to the edge of the bore is 4 millimeters, so I have the x coordinate at 4 millimeters. And I'll start adding by a control left mouse button, adding more vertices. So I want to step up 3.5 millimeters in the Z, and I still want the X to be 4, so that will get it right to the face of the bore. And another control, and then I want it to step out maybe another 3 millimeters, so right around 7.5 would be good in the X, and 3.5 in the Z, so it's still the same coordinate. And then another control left mouse button, and I want it to step up a little bit to get it off of the face of the bore. So again, it's at the same coordinate, which I left at 7.5, and then in the X, and then just a little bit, not even a millimeter, but maybe just 1 millimeter, so 4.5 in the Z, and then all the way out, and maybe a little bit higher, maybe 5 in the Z, and 11, which is half the outer diameter of the bearing. So 11 millimeters, 1.1 centimeters is fine in the X, and that puts it right on the edge of the outside edge of the bearing. Now the next one's going to be directly above it for maybe 3 millimeters. So what was it at? 4.5. So maybe that should be 7. So that's 2.5 millimeters thick. That might be a little thin. Yeah, maybe I'll go 7. Half a millimeter taller. There we go. And then the last point is going to be all the way back down, maybe not quite as high, maybe 6.5 in the Z, and 11 in the X. I mean 0 in the X, sorry. This should be 11 in the X. There we go. Now these are all the points, but I have this weird curvature going on, so I'm going to select all the vertices, and with the V, I want to make them all free vertices. And that way I can go through each vertex, and they're all in the plane, but I want to see each vertex to be a corner. Now to do that, I need the snap mode on, so I click on the snap mode or shift tab, and then I want to be on snapping to the grid. So now, deselecting everything, I can drag or select the control handles. I'm not sure why I can't drag them. And this one should be just, I don't care what the X is. In this case, the Y is 0, and the Z should be 0 also. So that puts it straight down. I could even drag it out a little bit. This vertex, it's not snapping to the grid, so I'm just going to force it to be 0 in the Z. I don't really care what it is in the X. This one, it's going to be 4 in the X, and some good positive number in the Z, such as 1. So now I see how I made those corners. So I'm going to go through every vertex and do that. So this Z coordinate should be 3.5, and give it a little bit more in the X, maybe 5. So 1 millimeter to the right. And this control handle for that vertex should be directly above it. which makes it 7.5. And its Z should be a little bit higher, so maybe 4. Then it. Zooming in quite a bit. This control handle, it's a little hard to see, and the snapping's a little weird, so I'm going to leave it where it is. And it's still 7.5 in the X, but a little bit higher in the Z, but not all the way to 4.5, so maybe 4, and maybe 4.2. Oops, in the Z. So I can see the gap. That makes it easier to control. And right above there, that needs to be the same 4.5 in the Z, I believe. So that puts it along there, and a little bit higher in the X, maybe 8, so 0.5 millimeter to the right. So I can see that bend. Actually, I might want to make it a little bit further as I zoom out. That's the step up. So actually, that's fine. This one I want straight up at 11. So the X coordinate being 11, and the Z just a little bit higher than it is, so maybe 5.5. So it gives it a nice square corner. Although that's not as necessary because that's not touching anything. But I don't want it going past the 11, so it can pass through the hole in the fidget spinner. So that's probably an okay idea. This, I actually like the curvature there. So I can snap that up and give it a little bit of bend. So that'll be a nice curve. And I just want to make sure that that curve has the same 6.5 in the Z, so it's straight across. And this one's not so necessary, but put that at 0 and the Z at 5. So a nice corner there. So there's the shape for my fidget spinner. I do need to convert this to a mesh, so I could maybe deal with that one as well. So 0 in the X. That needs to be 0. And Z, just some positive number like 1. It's a nice corner there. So now I've got all of them nicely positioned. A nice little curve here. 3.5 millimeter depth. So at this point I want to go to object mode and convert this to a mesh, and that's an Alt-C. And I want to mesh from curve. Now there's a problem with that, so go back in edit mode, and I get a bunch of extra vertices that I want to clean up. So easy enough to do. Select those, and then I don't want to delete them because that would just take away the edge, but I want to dissolve the vertices, and that just preserves the shape of the line but gets rid of the excess vertices. So just X and dissolve vertices. And so go through and clean up the mesh. So there. So that where there's a curvature, I don't need to really clean it up, but where there's straight edges, I do. So I'm going to leave that curvature there. There. Now I have curvature where I want and straight edges where I need. Okay, so at this point I'm ready to create the fidget, the cap. So I'm going to select all the vertices, and because I have that 3D printing, not ready for that yet, but I'm going to use the spin tool, or Alt-R, but the spin, I want to use the tool here because it's not going to spin it around the right axis first of all. I really want it around the z-axis, so I'm going to set the y-axis to 0. I want it to spin around that z, and once I do that, I'll just use 1 for the z number. And now I can see half of the mesh happening here, so I can see what it's doing with the spinning. I can change my angle to 360 degrees all the way around, and that creates that mesh. And I don't have that's not good resolution, so I want to set my steps up to a nice high number. I think we use 72 in class. So now it makes it smooth, and I have this great mesh. Just a couple things to do at the seam. It's going to have duplicates, so if I just select all the vertices and just remove the doubles, that should take care of it. One other step in the 3D printing is just to make it manifold. I don't think that's going to be an issue, but just to be sure. And then there's my fidget spinner cap, so it can fit inside the bore of the bearing, step and not hit the face, and then have a nice surface for your finger. So there it is. I won't go through the exporting to the STL or saving, but at this point, this mesh should provide for a good fidget spinner cap.